In 1815, the Battle of Waterloo brought to an end the Napoleonic age and restored the old Bourbon monarchy to the throne of France. But the revolutionary spirit of 1789 refused to disappear, and the next decade saw France bitterly divided between conservative and revolutionary factions. This divided age produced some of the greatest achievements in French painting and literature. Dominating these achievements were the novels of Honoré de Balzac. He was a writer whose life was often troubled. His childhood was miserable. As an adult, he was afflicted by doubt, illness, and debt. But Balzac overcame these difficulties to create an amazing work of literature. Entitled The Human Comedy, it was an enormous fictional panorama of every aspect of the author's society. Intended to comprise no less than 150 separate novels and stories. Though the project was never completed, what Balzac did achieve remains remarkable. In the history of literature, The Human Comedy is a unique achievement, a masterpiece from the pen of a unique man that has influenced almost every writer who has come after him.
Every writer finds elements in their own life to use in their novels. But the remarkable thing about Balzac is that he was actually a very unautobiographical writer. And as Baudelaire said, it's really the visionary, the imaginary aspects of Balzac's work that make it realistic, because it always seemed to him that his real merit lay in his being a visionary and an impassioned visionary.
We have no other work, until perhaps Tolstoy, which gives us such a broad picture of the society of this period. I mean, I think we often forget how much of our historical understanding of the first half of the 19th century comes from this literary portrait of it. And that is, I think, an amazing achievement.
The ambition of La Comédie humaine is to cover the whole of the French society. And he sees himself very much as a historian. He senses all the underground currents in that society and all the implications for the future.
Honoré Balzac was born on May the 20th, 1799 at Tours in France's Loire Valley. He was the second son of 53-year-old Bernard François Balzac and his much younger wife, Anna Charlotte Lohr. Their first child had died in infancy, and as a precaution, the infant Honoré was sent out to be nursed, only returning home at the age of 4. His father was the son of a peasant who persuaded the local priest to teach him how to read and write. He became a clerk in a lawyer's office and rose rapidly to be an efficient administrator for the government. He gained a reputation as a free thinker and an eccentric, and at the age of 79, fathered a child on a local village girl. By the time he was 8 years old, Honoré was the eldest of 4 Balzac children. These included Laura Sophie, the eldest of 2 sisters and a lifelong confidant for her brother, and Henri, the result of his mother's affair with a local landowner, Jean de Margon. It was an unconventional family life that was to provide Balzac with material and inspiration for many of his greatest novels. But in 1807, Honoré Balzac was separated from his family once more. He was sent to the college of Vendôme, 35 miles northeast of Tours. What followed was 6 years of solitude and misery. Vendôme was a Spartan institution, a monastic boarding school that actively discouraged any contact between pupil and parent. Between the age of 8 and his early teenage years, Honoré Balzac saw his mother on just 2 occasions. In modern times, we might consider this the worst kind of child deprivation. But the young Honoré had still more reason to be tormented by life at Vendôme. The boys lived in dormitories, each divided up into barred cubicles. On hundreds of occasions, the troublesome boy Balzac was punished by solitary imprisonment in his cubicle, or worse still, a cupboard, little better than a dungeon. Unsurprisingly, his schoolwork failed to impress, and from an early age he found himself withdrawing into the world of books. Throughout his life, he would be a voracious reader. In time, he would become equally passionate about his writing. Eventually, in 1813, Honoré could take no more. He broke down with what was described as a form of coma. His sister later claimed that her brother's young brain was simply worn out by excessive reading. Whatever the reason, he had escaped from Vendôme, and the remainder of his teenage years were far happier. His family moved to Paris, and he attended the Lycée Charlemagne, now home to the great Picasso Museum. Here, he acquired a lifelong taste for coffee. He also began to feel a sense of his own destiny. Like many adolescents, Honoré Balzac wanted to be famous, but this young man wanted to be famous as a genius. He was simply uncertain about what sort of genius he would be.
There were two contradictory effects of his childhood. One was that it was such a miserable, lonely childhood that he was always trying to escape from it in his writing. And so his novels don't necessarily reflect his childhood. But on the other hand, you could say that he was also trying to recapture that childhood that perhaps he never had, when the imagination is more important than reality and when there's no real division between the real world and the world of fantasy.
He dabbled with the idea of becoming a philosopher. After he left school in 1816, he spent much of his time reading the work of Plato and other giants of Greek thought. He began to outline absurdly ambitious philosophical works of his own, even as he worked as a law clerk in the chambers of a family friend. But Balzac soon realized that his calling was literature, and in August 1819, he began his quest for literary fame. Aided by a small allowance from his doubting parents, he rented a tiny garret room on Paris's Rue Lerdeguerre, where he would create his masterpieces. He knew that, at first, his life would be austere and isolated, not unlike that of his school days, but it would be worth it. His adult life was about to begin.
The career of literature was not something that someone of his class necessarily could succeed at very easily. His products were very, very strange, very varied, not what one associates with Balzac as a writer, melodramas and potboilers, Gothic novels.
One can say it had a certain influence on his later work because, of course, it was his apprenticeship. He was learning to write. He was learning how to put books together. Also, there is a type of character which appears in the early works and which survives into the later works. In particular, the outlaw. There's a character called Argo the pirate in the earlier novels, who can be seen as a model of the criminals, the professional criminals, or particularly Vautrin in his later novels.
Though Balzac was convinced of his own abilities, his early works were devoid of any hint of greatness. Alone in his Parisian garret, his family having moved to the nearby town of Villeparisis, his first work was Cromwell, a lamentable tragedy in verse based on the life of the English Civil War leader. Cromwell failed to find a publisher, and negative reaction from his family convinced Balzac to concentrate on prose. 2 years later, he secured his first publishing deal, writing pulp novels known as potboilers. These melodramatic tales of heroes, villains, and damsels in distress prevented Balzac from starving, but great literature they were not. Published under such pseudonyms as Lord de Huns and Horace de Saint-Aubin, their author was in no doubt as to their lack of artistic value. Although these mass-market titles do reveal Balzac's early interest in mysticism.
His pseudonymous work is in some ways typical of commercial novels of the time. So there's a lot of nefarious villains and spotless virgins and severed limbs and so on. It did influence his later work because it was a kind of apprenticeship. He was learning how to develop characters, how to present scenes that would make the reader want to find out what happened next. But it was also a kind of rubbishing of earlier literature. It represented the kind of novel that Balzac, in the end, didn't write. So you could also say that he was literally writing off earlier developments in the French novel.
By 1824, Balzac, the would-be genius was depressed by his lack of recognition, and like many struggling young writers, he seriously considered suicide. There is little doubt that one night he had to be persuaded not to jump into the River Seine. Embittered, he railed against those critics who were dismissive of his melodramas, and in 1825, after the publication of his 9th pseudonymous title, he decided to give up his writing career. Instead, he audaciously turned his hand to business. He set up as a publisher, despite lacking money, experience, and business contacts, borrowing the startup capital in an uncertain economic climate. He was taking an enormous risk. He was not the only one. Speculative ventures were popular in France at the time. Balzac, like many others, could not resist the lure of a potential quick fortune. The result was as disastrous for Balzac as it was for many of his fellow countrymen. As an unknown, many booksellers simply refused to stock his books. His reaction was to become a printer. When that failed, he moved into type founding, financial pressure growing all the time. By 1828, the pressure became too much. The business collapsed. Though he avoided bankruptcy, Balzac was left with 50,000 francs of debt. It would be a burden he would bear for the rest of his life.
Going into a publishing business when he was a writer reflected his conception of the artist in this early part of the 19th century, and the artist as a kind of commercial producer as well. The author was not, as one might think of it, simply the one who wrote the work, but also the one who brought it into being in the most physical sense. And this is very much, I think, part of the technological revolution of literature in the early part of the 19th century.
For the student of literature, Balzac's business failure had a positive side effect. In the autumn of 1828, partly to escape his creditors, he travelled to Brittany. He had decided to return to writing, and in the far west of France, he carried out research for his next piece of work, a novel based on the Chouan peasant rebellions of the 1790s. This time, it would be under his own name. It was a book that Balzac himself considered the beginning of his literary career, entitled Les Derniers Chouans et les Bretagnes en 1799. It is usually referred to as simply Les Chouans. The opening chapter of Les Chouans contains a vivid descriptive passage typical of what was to become Balzac's documentary style. In it, he describes a group of lowly peasant soldiers who have begun to take on the appearance of the animals whose skins they wear as clothing. The idea is disturbing, and the image stays with the reader throughout the book.
Some of the peasants, indeed the majority of them, went barefoot and were clad only in a great goatskin, reaching from neck to knees, and breeches of white, very coarse cloth. Their long, lank locks appeared part of the hair of the goatskins, and hid their downcast faces such that it was easy to imagine on first sight that the goatskins were their own pelts, and to confuse these wretches with the animals that clothed them. One soon saw their eyes through this hair, but the human intelligence they showed was no pleasant surprise. Rather, it was terrifying.
Les Chouans was based on the Breton rebellion against the Republican government that began in the 1790s. Balzac took great pains to research the historical background of his book, travelling to Brittany, where the action is set, speaking to local people who had witnessed the rebellion, and recording the stories of those whose friends or family had been involved with the Chouans. In the introduction to the first edition of 1829, Balzac says of Les Chouans, "In this book, the country is real country, the men, true men, and the words they used." This concern for authenticity was to continue throughout Balzac's career. His interest in representing the true history of events and individuals, combined with his detailed descriptions of his characters and settings, earned him the reputation of being one of the first and most influential figures in the school of French writing known as realism.
Realism was originally used as an insult, like Impressionism. And the idea was that a work of art, a painting or a novel, isn't supposed to reproduce reality. It's supposed to be an alternative to reality. And people don't want to go to the theatre to be depressed. They read novels because they want to be entertained and made happy. And realism was actually applied to literature after Balzac's death. And he was then retrospectively seen as the grandfather of all the realists. He was, in the sense that when you look at the later novels that were called realist, like the novels of the Goncourt brothers or Madame Bovary by Flaubert, there is that same element of social criticism, that same attempt to tackle every subject, even if it seemed too sordid or trivial for serious literature. So even though the movement only existed after Balzac's death, he can be described as the greatest of the realists.
The language of realist literature was meant to give the illusion, and I underline illusion, of an objective representation of reality. That is where the personality of the author was not obviously present, as though the work itself was telling the story or was happening as the reader read it.
Describing the society he lives in detail, if he can, purely to show how it works, the mechanism of that particular society, how its contradictions can bring different solutions through the life of different characters. That's what Balzac's realism is all about. By the time he reaches the end of his life in 1846, when he writes La Cousine Bette, he sees there is a huge threat on the bourgeoisie, on the power that the bourgeoisie had had for about 50 years, and it is the birth of the working class. And indeed, 2 years after La Cousine Bette is the revolution of 1848, the first working class revolution.
With the publication of Les Huns, the 30-year-old Balzac had at last found his voice. It was quickly followed by La physiology de mariage, a treatise on marital union that proved especially popular with women readers, as did much of his subsequent work. Balzac's relationships with women in his personal life undoubtedly contributed to this popularity. He had many close female associates. His sister, Laure, was a lifelong confidant, as was her close friend, Zulma Courant.
Balzac had realized, before most other novelists, that the market for novels was mostly female. He used as his source his female friends, and probably knew more about women's lives than most male novelists. In fact, he wrote more about women's lives even than female novelists. He published a novel called Memoir de deux jeunes mariés, the memoirs of two young brides, in which, for the first time in French literature, women could see described all the details of pregnancy and childbirth and child rearing. So I think it was partly that transformation of lives which, on the whole, weren't public, and which, in social terms, were inferior to men's lives, promoted to first place in fiction. It's what Baudelaire, talking about Balzac, called the heroism of modern life.
In 1823, he had experienced his first love affair with Madame de Dernier, a married woman of 45 who became his most valuable friend. In 1826, Balzac's second affair began with another older woman, the Duchess of Abrantes, a veteran of the court of Napoleon, whose memories were eagerly noted by the young author. Relationships like this taught Balzac about the importance of human passion, and he incorporated his experiences into his work.
He had two liaisons with women very much older than himself, and this is something one sees again in the novels. I mean, one of Balzac's main characters, Rastignac, who is the hero of Père Goriot, Old Goriot, arrives in Paris as a young man and makes his way partly through his liaison with a much older woman.
Well, you could call his relationships with other women encyclopedic, because he knew so many different kinds of women. There was a woman called Caroline Marthe-Bouty, who went on holiday with him to Italy dressed as a man. And she was generally thought to be Balzac's male page, and this gave rise to certain rumors about Balzac's sexuality, which were probably true. On the whole, he chose women who were already very experienced, and quite often women who knew about historical periods on which Balzac had little information. So he was a very practical lover, but he was also a very passionate lover. He met an English woman who had married an Italian count. And Balzac was always attracted to aristocrats. And in some ways, he was a bit of a snob. He spent a week in Boulogne on the coast with her. He may even have crossed the Channel and come to England. And Balzac himself later became convinced that her child was his. She seems to have thought that the child was someone else's because she gave the child the name of one of her other lovers. But Balzac thought it was his child, and he dedicated a short story called Le Chef-d'œuvre inconnu, the unknown masterpiece, to a lord, which looked very good as a dedication of a novel.
The early 1830s were on the surface a good time for Balzac. As he established himself as a man of letters, he carried the airs of a raffish young dandy. He moved in the salons of the literary society and became a regular fixture at the opera house. His sharp wit made him a popular guest at social events, and his female admirers wrote him from all over Europe. As an affectation, he began to refer to himself as Honoré de Balzac, rather than simply Balzac. It was an age when details like that mattered. His days in the garret were long behind him, and his elaborately furnished boudoir became a talking point in society circles. But Balzac's success was built on shaky foundations. He remained heavily in debt to a number of creditors, including his mother. When his father died in 1829, Honoré's inheritance passed directly to her, a state of affairs that the author found galling. His response was to work prodigiously. Fueled by enormous quantities of coffee, Balzac worked for anything up to 16 hours at a time, and usually through the night. In 1832, these solitary efforts resulted in a novel that firmly established his status as a major figure in French literature, The Wild Ass's Skin, or Le Peau de Chagrin. Le Peau de Chagrin is a magical tale with a moral message. In it, Balzac introduced all the fantastic elements of a classic fable and combined them with the descriptive detail he had refined in Les Huans. The result was a book that still raises philosophical questions about the nature of man, and in particular, the human concepts of motivation and will.
Balzac was exceedingly interested in philosophy, even from his earliest youth. He spent a long time immersing himself in ancient philosophy, for example, but also in a kind of more mystical philosophy from both medieval writers and later on. He was someone who had a sort of view of the beyond, certainly, which he defined in many different ways, the ideal, and the union of that ideal with the real, the union of the soul with the body. And this was all bound up with ideas of the time of mesmerism, magnetism, life after death. He wrote a treatise on the immortality of the soul when he was a young man, around his 20th year.
The protagonist of the novel is Raphael, a destitute young man who, at the beginning of the book, contemplates suicide by drowning himself in the River Seine, just as Balzac had done in real life. Raphael's suicide attempt is interrupted, as was that of the author, and the young man ventures through the streets of Paris until he comes across the showrooms, curiosity shops full of unusual objects and antiquities. Here, he discovers the wild ass's skin of the book's title, a talisman of ass's hide marked with mysterious Sanskrit lettering. Against the reasoning of the mysterious and sinister showroom dealer, Raphael seizes the skin and wishes for a life of excess. Like Marlowe's Faust, he enters into an occult bargain that he knows must end in torment. The rejection of his life by the slow shrinkage of the ever-tightening skin in return for the realization of his every wish and desire. This is a death much slower and more painful than drowning. It is self-destruction, brought about by the desire for excessive pleasure. Raphael has time to contemplate his demise, and the tale becomes an allegory of the conflict in man between two apparently irreconcilable urges, the will to enjoy and the will to survive. Balzac uses the voice of the dealer to convey his message and warns the young man of the lessons to come.
I will reveal to you, in few words, one of the great mysteries of human life. Man exhausts himself by two acts, accomplished instinctively, which dry up the sources of his existence. Two words can express all the forms that these two causes of death assume: will and power. The exercise of the will consumes us. The exercise of power destroys us. But the pursuit of knowledge leaves our infirm constitution in a state of perpetual calm.
La Peau de Chagrin was an immediate success on its release in 1831, but the life of its author remained troubled. In 1832, many of Balzac's associates were convinced that he had descended into madness. There is no doubt that he suffered from visual and auditory hallucinations. He took to working in a white garb of a monk. His eccentricity once led him to prepare a meal for friends in which every course consisted of onions, and the thought of suicide never truly left him. In 1832, however, an event occurred that made him think of nothing but life. That year, in his own mind at least, Honoré de Balzac found the woman of his dreams. In February 1832, he received a letter from one of the many female admirers of his work, an anonymous message signed simply L'étranger, stranger. We do not know the contents of this first letter, but the novelist was enthralled. A correspondence began between the two, with de Balzac initially delivering his letters to a messenger. The more he found out about this mysterious woman, the more he was convinced that she was what he had been waiting for. She was Evelyn Hanska, a 26-year-old Ukrainian countess whose estates near Kiev consisted of 21,000 acres of land and over 3,000 serfs. But Balzac was attracted to Evelyn for more than just her wealth.
I think the first thing that attracted him was the fact that he'd never seen her. She sent him an anonymous letter, and he was able to construct a certain image of her that corresponded to his ideal woman. Someone who was older than him, larger than him, and someone who wasn't easily crushed by the society in which she lived. She could be constructed like a fictional character. The remarkable thing is that on the basis of a few letters, he seems to have come up with the right image. He does seem to have corresponded more or less to what Balzac wanted her to be. And most of their relationship was conducted by letter. So if the reality was different, and in the end it does seem to have been quite different from Balzac's view of it, he was able to preserve this fantasy. Despite the fact that he often talked about his need for sexual satisfaction, it is significant that the most passionate relationship he had was with a woman he hardly ever saw.
In September 1833, Honoré de Balzac and Evelyn Hanska met for the first time. She was traveling in Switzerland, and her novelist correspondent journeyed to meet her. When he did, he was overjoyed. In a letter to his sister, he described Evelyn as ravishingly beautiful, as well as subtly mentioning her fortune. For her part, Evelyn was not disappointed with de Balzac. Evelyn was married to a man 20 years her senior, and her home was far away in the Ukraine. Only when the Count died could they have a chance of being truly together. They decided it was worth the wait. Honoré and Evelyn now began what was effectively a relationship in words.
It was a huge correspondence. It's about a quarter the size of all the novels in La Comédie humaine. Balzac wrote almost every day, wrote very long letters, and it could be described as a literary work in its own right, although actually it shows what Balzac's novels would have been like if he hadn't worked on them so much.
Balzac does have a very interesting correspondence, not only with Madame Ansgar, of course, but with his sister, with many others. And I think that the kinds of ideas that he discusses in his letters, genius, love, life, representation, these are things that do, in many ways, shed light on what he's representing in his novels. They don't necessarily explain them directly, but they give us a different perspective on the novels. Although we tend to associate him, of course, with the great novels, his writing was extremely diverse. He was, of course, a journalist, an art critic. He wrote a number of quasi-philosophical treatises, a number of sort of sociological treatises, and I think we have to consider his correspondence in that context. It's part of the literary output of Balzac.
The start of the long-distance relationship with Evelyn was an important event in Balzac's life, and around this time he also initiated a bold new approach to his work. He sought to organize it all into a composite whole, including work not yet written. Inspired by Dante's Divine Comedy, Balzac gave the project the title of La Comédie humaine, the human comedy. It would be a literary monument containing his novels and stories, arranged in groups or cycles within one unifying structure.
It's interesting that he chose that title, La Comédie humaine. Why allude deliberately to Dante's work? Well, it's partly that Dante also depicted a whole society as an element of contemporary satire. He was also using Dante's image of hell, just as Dante's hell has different layers. So does modern Paris, from the highest aristocrats to the plebs, right at the bottom of society.
Certainly, Balzac wished to give the same sentiment that one gets from the Divine Comedy, that is, a sense of the whole of society in its moral complexity, its vices, its virtues, its failings and successes, as we have, of course, in Dante.
The first arrangement of the comedy appeared in 1842 in a 17-volume edition. Later works were added in subsequent editions to fit the pattern Balzac had established in the original. Like Dante, Balzac divided his comedy into three parts: Études d'amour, studies of manners; Études philosophiques, philosophical studies; and Études analytiques, analytical studies. His treatise on marriage would be included in this latter group, while, unsurprisingly, La Peau de Chagrin was allocated to the philosophical work. In all, Balzac intended the Comédie humaine to include 150 novels and stories. At the time of his death, the whole project was approximately 2/3 complete, with the studies of manners the most complete of the three separate parts. These books were organized into several smaller cycles. These are scenes of private life, provincial life, Parisian life, political life, military life, and country life. All are given a contemporary setting by Balzac and describe various aspects of French society at the time, both public and private. He describes vividly events such as the breakup of marriages, the trials of war, family squabbles, political wrangling, all set against the background of his own turbulent times. Balzac's overall intention was to document the vastness of society with all its conflicts and dramas. He saw his characters as actors in a large cast, moving in and out of focus, and described his literary intention with one memorable phrase.
A generation is a drama of 4,000 or 5,000 prominent characters. That drama is my book.
He decided to produce La Comédie humaine partly because he wanted to market his novels. If he presented all his novels as sections of a larger work, it was easier to get people to subscribe to the whole edition.
He's always been interested in systems, in vast views on society, and his main goal, before he even thought of writing La Comédie humaine as such, was to compare humanity and animality, very much as the naturalist Buffon did in France, because he thought there were as many social types as animal types, and he thought he could have a kind of overall view on society like that.
To achieve his ambitious aims with La Comédie humaine, Balzac needed to create an enormous number of characters, over 2,000 in total. He wove the stories of these individuals and their families from one narrative to another, linking them together in the one large tapestry that formed the overall work. Many of his characters are introduced in one novel and reappear in another. The sinister criminal and manipulator, Vautrin, can be seen wreaking havoc in a cycle of novels which includes Splendeur et misère des courtisans, often translated as A Harlot High and Low. He also appears in an 1840 play which bears his name, Corentin, from Les Chouans, written in 1829, appears as an older man in the tale Une ténébreuse affaire, or A Murky Business, published in 1841. In it, he has aged according to the lapse in the storytelling. The same is true of Hulot, who appears in other books. This is a man first introduced to the reader in Les Chouans as a determined and clear-headed commandant. By the time he appears in The Provincial Muse, written in 1843, Hulot has been promoted to a colonel, and when he is seen again in 1846 in the novel La Cuisine Bête, he has retired as a marshal and a peer of France. In contrast to his first appearance, Hulot is now an old man, deaf and marked by the years of his life of service, but the reader can still recognize the spirit of the young man in the description of the old.
This peer of France, excused now from sittings of the chamber on account of his deafness, had a fine head, frosted by the years, whose grey thatch was thick enough yet to show the indent left by the pressure of his hat. Small and stocky and grown lean, he wore his old green age with sprightly gaiety, and with the preservation of an exceedingly active spirit. His kind and gentle approach to life was reflected in his pale face, his bearing and his tactful conversation, full of common sense. He never talked of war or campaigns, knowing himself too great to need a show of his greatness.
By drawing the lives of his characters in and out of the reader's sight from novel to novel, Balzac gives them the appearance of possessing independent lives. It is as if old Hulot has been living all the while, progressing through the military and political strata of French life, and that Balzac merely shows us snippets of Hulot's continuous biography when he considers it appropriate to the story. Balzac increasingly employed the practice of reappearing characters as the Comédie humaine took shape. This allowed him to develop the psychology of his characters, to define their speech and mannerisms, and to follow through the various stages of their lives, aging them and altering their circumstances accordingly. Because he presents the reader with so many characters, each one is very simply expressed. There is not enough room in a novel for each of the characters to fully emerge. The detailed depth and rounding of characters could be more easily achieved over the course of several books than in a single novel. This process also strengthened the illusion that the fictional world in which Balzac's characters exist was in some way real. In the preface to his collected works in 1842, Balzac declared that it was his intention to be the secretary of French society. In his works, he wished to represent characters of every class, age, and occupation. The extent to which he succeeded is still debated today.
La Comédie humaine is a huge achievement. It's one of the great literary monuments. And Henry James, who could be quite snooty about Balzac, only found Shakespeare to compare with him. It was never finished, and it probably never could be finished because it was such a huge ambition to depict a whole society. And it's often said that Balzac did miss out certain aspects of modern French society, that the workers on the whole tend to be missing, or urban workers anyway. There is a long novel devoted to rural peasants. But those weaknesses are its strengths, because Balzac had to believe that it was possible to depict a whole society, otherwise he never would have produced what he did, which is one of the great literary works.
The Comédie humaine is a tremendous achievement in what it tells us about this period of 19th century France, which was so crucial to the history of modernity, the subsequent history of modernity. In its variety, there is nothing else like it. In its diversity, it's absolutely unique in that sense. And so for all its unevenness, for all the sort of weirdness of some of its works, the repetition one might find and so on, it remains, of course, an absolutely major work in the history of literature.
It is no surprise that La Comédie humaine took up the majority of Balzac's working life in the 1830s and 1840s, but the success of its component works failed to assist the author's often desperate finances. Part of the reason was his insistence on rewriting work after it had been printed, an approach that cost him dearly in printers' bills. On occasions, he had to lie low in Paris or flee the city altogether as his creditors closed in. He continued to dream of the speculation that would make him rich. A fruitless journey to Sardinia in search of ancient Roman silver mines indicated a continued childlike fascination with buried treasure, none of which he ever found. Despite being a man whose work was known and discussed across Europe, Honoré de Balzac never succeeded in throwing off his debts.
He was tremendously successful. He was very famous, even early on. But on the other hand, he was someone who didn't recover from the first debt, which of course he had to try to pay back. He had a very high level of living. When he finally married Madame Anscar, for example, he set up a fabulously lavish flat. Probably his debts were never entirely absent from his life. But maybe that was part of his character as well. Perhaps that had something to do with this immense productivity which he had over a period of, well, not more than 20 years, really.
Of course, he was not the only man with money worries at the time, and this is made crystal clear in the Comédie humaine. The studies of manners contains many tales of characters struggling to find power through the accrual of wealth. Ambitious shopkeepers raise and cling to the money they piece together through diligence and careful business speculation. Moneyed families and the high bourgeoisie lose whole fortunes through their own foolishness, squandering their wealth or falling foul of the covetous deceptions of others. These are stories of intrigue, of false starts, and of the conflict between the emotional and material. Old Goriot and Eugénie Grandet are two of the finest of them all. In the latter, Eugénie Grandet is deceived by her cousin Charles, who rids her of her store of savings and, once in possession of her wealth, refuses to settle his own father's debts or to return to marry the patiently waiting Eugénie. Monsieur Grandet, Eugénie's father, is a rich miser whose love of money is made obvious. Time and again in the Comédie humaine, Balzac turned his attention to the effect of money on human society. Also in the collection Studies of Manners, the scenes of Parisian life provide a detailed picture of life in the French capital at the time. All the pettiness and misfortunes of city society exist in this collection. In the cycle of tales, Splendeurs et misères de courtisans, or A Harlot High and Low, the sinister Vautrin moves around the streets, thieving, impersonating and manipulating. In La Cousine Bête and La Cousine Pense and César Berarteau, we find disappointment, manipulation, and the shame of squandered wealth. Families fight each other for material possessions and social position. Businesses and ventures fail. The streets of Paris are full of poverty, and even the drawing rooms of the high bourgeoisie are affected by the ever-changing nature of Parisian society.
The French Revolution had changed everything. There was no longer a rigid hierarchy, and it was possible for people to move through the different layers of society. And Balzac depicted this brilliantly. It's a very difficult thing to depict because he wasn't just depicting one unified society that never changed. He couldn't rely on just depicting people as types, a typical worker, a typical aristocrat. And his achievement is to show that dynamism, that constant motion of capital, money, constantly flowing upwards, and people who start at the top of society moving downwards. So that's probably his greatest achievement.
Money in Balzac's novels, of course, is one of the main characters, if you can call it that. All relationships are based on money. People are concerned with making money, preserving it, conserving it, spending others' money. Human relationships are described in terms of money. People move up the social ladder via money, marrying into it, speculation being absolutely rampant. He himself was, of course, a good example of this. I mean, his business that he starts goes bust, he's in debt, he has to make money.
Between 1830 and 1848, you can see Balzac showing and writing about a bourgeoisie which is steadily more and more corrupt. Just before the 1848 revolution, which is the first working class revolution in France, he writes a novel called La Cousine Bête. One character, the young woman, who starts rebelling against a certain state of things, namely marriage as an institution. And she decides, when her husband becomes unfaithful to her, to leave him. And she does that with a child, and for the first time in Balzac's entire writing career, you can see that he thinks she's justified in doing so, because now society is so immorally orientated, if you like. There is no reason why women should remain virtuous.
By the time La Cousine Bête was released in 1846, the genius of Honoré de Balzac was undeniable, but by then he was increasingly a sick man, afflicted by a heart condition and worn out by the intense solitary pressure of his work. He had less than 4 years to live, but these final years would be spent with the woman he truly loved. In January 1842, de Balzac received news that filled him with joy. The husband of Evelyn, Count Wenceslas, was dead. Immediately he began to think of their life together. By 1847, he was living in the Ukraine on his love's great estate, although their formal union would only arrive when Honoré de Balzac was already mortally sick. On the 14th of March 1850, in a small Ukrainian parish church, they married. Shortly afterwards, Honoré de Balzac returned to Paris, where he died on 18th of August. He was 51. His life had often been fraught with difficulty. His great work remained unfinished, but what he was able to achieve was remarkable. Honoré Balzac is one of the true greats of 19th century literature, a chronicler of life in France whose finest works are still enjoyed today, not just in France, not just in Europe, but across the world.
All his characters are gifted with that ardour of life that animated himself. All his fictions are as deeply coloured as dreams. From the highest peaks of the aristocracy to the lowest depths of the people, all the actors of the comedy are more greedy for life, more active and cunning in the struggle, more patient in misfortune, more gluttonous in the gratification of desire, more angelic in devotion than they appear in the comedy of the real world. In Balzac, even the doorkeepers have genius. All his minds are weapons loaded to the muzzle with will, just like Balzac himself.